So, good evening, everyone. It's wonderful to have you all join us this evening. It's wonderful to have so many colleagues here as well, and to be hosting this Tishah B'av event together with Kol Chai, as we always do at Northwood, but also together with Brighton Hove Progressive Synagogue, and to have Rabbi Naomi Goldman from Kol Chai and Rabbi Eli Tikva from Brighton Hove Progressive Synagogue with us this evening. And of course, it's particularly my pleasure to be able to welcome Rabbi Dr. Susan Einbinder this evening. One of the very few real upshots and positives of the coronavirus pandemic is that we can travel the world without having to travel the world. And so it's wonderful to be able to welcome you all the way from Providence in the States. And it's really our pleasure to be able to welcome you this evening for this event. I can just see my screen share is showing some funny things. Let me just show the right thing. I don't know what happened. There we go. Let's try that again. This is the challenge of the technology. This is better. Now you're not just seeing the Zoom screen share. So it's our pleasure to be able to welcome you, Rabbi Dr. Susan Einbinder. Rabbi Einbinder was ordained as a rabbi at the Hebrew Union College, and then later continued to do a PhD in English and comparative literature, and has been teaching as a professor at various institutions, including New York University, the University of Maryland, then for a significant time at Hebrew Union College, starting as an assistant professor, later an associate professor, and then as a full professor of Hebrew literature. And now Dr. Einbinder is a professor at the University of Connecticut in Hebrew and Judaic studies. And her specialty area is the subject of our lecture this evening, or actually more broadly, I think, Jewry, medieval Jewry. But this evening we'll be focusing on the work that she's done on Jewish responses to the Black Death. So it's my pleasure. I'm going to stop my screen share and hand over to Dr. Einbinder so that she can share our screen with us. And it's my pleasure to welcome her as well as all of you this evening. Over to you.
Can you hear me, everyone?
Perfect.
Great. Thank you. First, all of you, for this invitation to join you for the start of Tishah B'av. And Tishah B'av, we know, commemorates past communal tragedies. And I will be talking to you today about one example that has occupied me as a scholar for some years, and that is Jewish responses to plague during the Black Death and then during later outbreaks of plague. My message for you is that, like Tishah B'av itself, the example of plague is not merely a story of mourning, but a lesson in continuity, resilience, and courage that offers a strange kind of solace in the shadow of COVID-19 today. The Black Death that traversed Europe in the mid-14th century was a stunning pandemic, killing between 40 to 60% of the overall population. In some places, the statistics were better. In others, they were much worse, reaching near total annihilation. And like our COVID-19, bubonic plague is a zoonosis. It is caused by an organism that lives often benignly among animals, and it becomes a human story only accidentally when disruption of the local ecosystem collides animal and human worlds. In most other respects, bubonic plague is not at all like COVID-19. Plague is caused by a bacillus, Yersinia pestis, which is named for the scientist Alexander Yersin, who first identified it in 1894. And Yersinia pestis is, of course, carried by fleas or lice that migrate from animal hosts to human ones. It's not contagious between humans, although it can mutate into contagious pneumonic and septicemic forms. In contrast, as you know, COVID-19 is a virus and highly contagious. Nonetheless, when confronted by a previously unknown and lethal disease, human beings have only a limited repertoire of responses. The experience of disease and death on a massive scale, what people did, how they coped and what they felt, how they picked up the pieces of shattered families, businesses, communities, and meaning are what I find most interesting, and indeed what proves relevant for comparison. Let me share with you then some of the ways that Jews experienced the plague. I'm going to give you 3 examples, 2 from the Black Death proper and 1 from a later outbreak. First, from a smallish town in Catalonia where Jews were brutally attacked during the Black Death. Second, from the epitaphs of Jewish plague victims to the north in Toledo. And third, from Italian Jewish plague liturgies from the 16th and 17th centuries. What most people think of when they think of Jews in the Black Death is anti-Jewish violence. Indeed, parts of Europe saw vicious assaults on Jewish communities as the plague approached. Most of the familiar examples come from Central Europe, Switzerland, and Italy. On the Iberian Peninsula, Jewish communities were attacked in the kingdoms of Aragon and Valencia. According to a Hebrew chronicle, on Tishah B'av of 1348, 300 Jews were slaughtered in a Catalonian town called Tàrrega, about 70 kilometers west of Barcelona. Until 2007, the Chronicle, now lost but cited elsewhere, was the only source known for this incident. But that year, during housing construction, bodies were discovered, skeletons. Earlier construction had already disclosed graves in this area, and initially they were assumed to belong to victims of the Spanish Civil War and reburied in the municipal cemetery. This time, archaeologists who were brought in suspected they might be looking at Tàrrega's medieval cemetery, Jewish cemetery. And from February through the summer of that year, 2007, they excavated 158 individual graves, the original cemetery, plus 6 communal burial pits containing at least 69 individuals. This was an incomplete excavation. Many of the skeletons bore signs of lethal trauma. Included in these communal graves were a variety of personal objects, including coins that facilitated firmer dating of the remains to the mid-14th century, so that the researchers soon became sure that they had uncovered the victims of the 1348 assault. Pressure mounted by outside Jewish groups forced a premature conclusion to their work, but the feverish labor of a few months still has taught us a lot. And I'm going to share this screen here, and hopefully you will see my pictures. Does that work?
Perfect.
Except that I can't move it.
Normally, if you click the mouse, it should work. Oh, you've stopped the screen share.
Let's see. All right, I am not getting this to budge.
It's okay if you, in the bottom right-hand corner again, if you, otherwise I can show your slides. Yeah, there.
Ah, thank you.
Perfect.
Got it. All right, so there you see one of the communal pits. And as you know, communal burial is not a normative Jewish practice. So the mere presence of these graves indicates that extreme circumstances characterize death, burial, or both. This assumption is reinforced by the cramped shape of the pits contorting their human contents. And you can see that here, if you can follow my cursor, you see how cramped these people are. And again, here. The 69 individuals ranged from a perinatal infant to adults in their 60s. Half of them were female. All were buried with care. Bodies did not overlap and their heads were at the west. These were Jews who were buried by other Jews, anxious to observe ritual requirements while working with some haste. For some of the dead, it was a second resting place, evoking the chronicler's description of bodies dragged to a cistern or tank. And one way you can tell that is by the flexed arms, right? And the assumption is that they were hoisted from somewhere else. Further testifying to haste, the bodies were clothed, and a treasure trove of objects was recovered with their remains. Coins clustered where they once had rested in a pouch or a purse. A crippled child was wearing amulets. Pottery, nails, keys, a thimble tell a story of death that came unexpectedly and a delayed burial that did not observe all proprieties. 37 of the 69 individuals bear marks of traumatic violence, 10 children and 27 adults. And of course, others may have been killed by injuries to organs and soft tissue. For that 37, a total of 155 bone lesions were tallied, 105 cranial, 1 to the spine, 11 to the arms, and 38 to the legs. Several victims had limbs amputated. One was killed by a blunt instrument, another skull crushed by a heavy object. In one case, an axe or sword handle penetrated the skull with such force that the outline of the handle stamped the bone. There are 2 decapitations. What these men, women, and children thought about plague, we will never know, nor what they thought about the terrifying transformation of neighbors and townsmen into killers. The task of making sense fell heavy on the shoulders and broken spirits of survivors. One of them wrote, "The banker, Moses Nathan, was a rare survivor of the Taraga massacre. Then, as now, money and connections made a difference in times of pandemic, and Moses fled Taraga for refuge with Christian friends in a nearby village. From there, he would go on to Barcelona and spend years trying futilely to recoup some of his losses. Sometime after the events of 1348, he wrote a liturgical poem, a piyut, for Tishah B'av, the anniversary of the attack. On the surface, Moses' piyut seems to lament the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, but the destruction of Targar and Jewry nestles in his language. In one place, for instance, Moses blames the absence of authority for violence, an accusation that makes no sense for ancient Jerusalem, but rings clearly for recent history. I'll read it to you in my English translation. The destruction was worse because there was no one anywhere to pay heed when men slaughtered their brothers. The faithful city entirely collapsed. There was no one to judge between claims or blood. The grievances of orphans and widows were not judged, for trustworthy men were gone. Moses decries the loss of Jewish leaders who might advocate for their people, a situation confirmed by communal regulations issued by the community after the plague. The speaker prays to be restored to his native home and pleads with God to forgive my debt and erase my sin, concluding with a prayer for the restoration of Jerusalem. Surely, like every good Jew, Moses hoped for that city's rebirth. But his verses remind us of Taraga too. Even the last verse, tapping well-known biblical consolations, concludes with Isaiah 51:3, where joy and song mark the rebirth of a city in ruins. In fact, over the next few years, Jews did return to Taraga and rebuild. When plague returned too in 1362, the city even hired a Jewish physician to treat residents who could not afford a doctor, and no one objected. As for Moses' lament, it passed into prayer books from Provence and Italy, where it was recited on Tishah B'av, not in memory of plague, but in a generic memory of violence. Even this new and terrible experience was contained by sacred history, erasing some of its particularity, but absorbing shattered lives and community into a story of continuity and faith. Thankfully, violence was not a universal experience during the Black Death. To the north, the Jews of Castile experienced no violence. The plague arrived late in 1348 or early 1349 and tapered off into 1351 to 52. Mortality was high, but not as high as in Catalonia or Aragon. Once again, we would have very little record of Jewish experience, if not for a string of coincidences, beginning this time with a 16th century Jewish tourist in Toledo, who wandered what remained of its extraordinary Jewish cemetery and transcribed almost 80 epitaphs. No one knows what he did with them, but they resurfaced 3 centuries later in the Turin Royal Library in Italy. There they were read by a Paduan Jewish poet and bibliophile, Joseph Almansi, who copied and sent them to Samuel David Luciato, Shadal. Shadal published them in 1841. In 1904, the Turin Library caught fire, destroying thousands of rare holdings, including almost all of the Hebrew manuscripts. The anonymous tourist transcription, which had miraculously survived 3 centuries of migration, was not so lucky this time and disappeared forever. The 1841 publication is what remained. Amazingly, so did a few of the stones. Fragments were toted off and recycled for use in other buildings or left for debris. Most of them disappeared forever. Several entire slabs, however, survived and were eventually housed in the Archaeological Museum in Toledo, where you can see their unique design. It's a sort of truncated pyramid inscribed in wraparound form. And you notice that the writing actually starts on the top and then spills over to a side, and you have to walk all the way around to read it. And while we have evidence for a medieval Ashkenazi custom of circling a graveyard, circumambulating an individual grave is not described elsewhere. And here you can see a sort of flattened out picture of it, right? And how that would work. And this particular tomb's inscription is for a woman named Sitbona, who was a victim of the Black Death. In fact, of 76 inscriptions covering several centuries, 28 describe deaths due to plague, the majority in 1349, but including 3 deaths from 1350 and 1 from 1352. And significantly, these memorials suggest that however grievous, the plague was not remembered in Toledo as a unique catastrophe. It is worth noting that these epitaphs belong to individual graves, meaning that plague did not overwhelm the formalities and rhythms of mourning, at least for the elite. And elsewhere, you know that because of the high mortality of plague, cities and communities often resorted to burial pits or trenches. In contrast, these Toledo Jews found individual burial with an epitaph that testifies to familiarity with the deceased and his family. True, the strolling copyist was selective. Only 3 of his plague epitaphs are for women. Notably, 2 of them were the first and second wives of the Ashkenazi-born rabbi of Toledo, Judah ben Harosh, and Sitbona, the third woman, was also distinguished by marriage and pedigree. In general, the Toledo inscriptions do not indicate the age of the deceased, and when they do, it is only to emphasize an untimely end. Chaim, the youngest of the plague group, was 14, and he was the son of Judah ben Harosh. There are no small children in the group, implying that they did not receive headstones. Chaim may have been singled out because of his illustrious family. The next youngest plague victim was Asher ben Yosef ben Turiel. Asher was 15, had married shortly before his death, and was recalled as an avid scholar. Epitaphs, like Hallmark greeting cards, pose obvious challenges for historians. Gravestone inscriptions rely on conventions that soften the distinctive edges of human personality. Many of the attributes inscribed in the Toledo epitaphs appear in more than one of them, and some are not exclusive to victims of plague. And yet, when read carefully, tiny additions or deletions animate cliché. An epitaph for Joseph Rabbi Meir Abul Afia, for instance, invokes only his mother. The father must be dead. Similarly, Sitbona's epitaph describes her father, her husband, but no children. Sitbona's epitaph concludes by tapping Isaiah 54:2, addressed to the barren one, meaning Israel awaiting redemption, and Jeremiah 31, Rachel weeping for her children. And in this way, the author of the epitaph subtly tells us that at the time of her death, Sitbona was childless. The many honorifics and titles attached to the names of the deceased pointed to social distinctions that meant something to the living. Overall, we find a generous set of descriptions of valiant, pious, generous, humble, learned, charitable, faithful, glorious, honorable, noble, modest, splendid, discreet, wise, intelligent, accomplished, righteous, honest, and beloved men who had the good fortune to marry wives or father daughters who were honest, pious, great, righteous, talented, charitable, humble, gracious, modest, and pure. This too tells us something about the public face of privilege in 14th century Toledo, at least as it saw itself: service to the community, protection of learning and wealth, literacy and diplomacy, good genes and generosity were attributes associated with an elite, but remembered for their public value. These were the same values upheld by this community before the Black Death. The pandemic forced no rupture with pre-existing conventions and no unparalleled sense of loss. A single example will have to suffice for the young Joseph Bar Meir Abul Afia Hamariri. The composer of this epitaph, which is one of my favorites, opens by addressing the dead youth directly, asking him why he is shut up in the rock of his tomb. And then the dead Joseph, introduces his own story. Ani hagever, raiti shod vashever, v'dam v'dever, v'katzru yimei alumai, v'yichtefuni pitom b'dmei yamai, nar v'rach shanim, v'liim ra'im v'ne'manim. I am the man who has seen desolation and destruction, blood and pestilence. The days of my youth were cut short suddenly in the prime of my life, young and tender in years. Evil, unending illnesses snatched me away. So Joseph tells us that he was cut down in his youth amidst great devastation, a motif that is underscored by the biblical echoes of the language. Jeremiah 48:3, describing the destruction of Moab, specifically evokes the wailing of the kingdom's youth. Joseph's death resulted from illness, citing Deuteronomy 28:59, where God threatens conquest, famine, and evil, unending sicknesses. And this passage was routinely cited in Christian and Jewish texts for its ominous proof that plague came as divine punishment. The dead boy goes on to describe his fate. Illness and pain forced him to abandon home and inheritance, including his recent bride. His abandoned house is described in the language of Jeremiah 12:7, where God's destruction falls upon livestock and land. His desolate household echoes Jeremiah 44, where God threatens the Israelites in Egypt with sword, famine, and plague. The youth laments that he was struck down with no one to inherit from me and recall my name among my people. Without an heir, he must recall himself. Anihu hamidaber hineni, v'shomea korotai chanini. It is I who must say, here I am, and let the one who hears what befell me have pity on me. Joseph belonged to the prominent Abu Afia dynasty, although his particular identity, as he feared, has been lost to time. His plea to be remembered exposes the reciprocal bond between the mourners and the mourned. It was a bond affirmed in the pilgrimage of family members and friends, and later even by strangers keeping faith with the dead as they circled and read. Certainly, medieval Jews believed in the power of the dead to intercede on their behalf, but Joseph's epitaph reminds us that intercession worked both ways. Plaintively, he beseeches his visitors to pray on his behalf. He has no children to fulfill this task, and his father must have predeceased him. When the epitaph swivels finally to the trope of parental grief, only Joseph's mother appears. She is distraught and desolate, in the words of Isaiah 54:11, a verse concluding with God's promise to rebuild his people on a foundation of precious stone, a promise echoed in Joseph's granite pyramid. Several themes, all of them reinforced by a clever web of biblical proof texts, elevate this text beyond its affecting surface narrative. Its biblical language alludes to stories in which plague has befallen the Israelites in punishment for their sins. Other phrases drawn from Jeremiah and Isaiah describe devastation, famine, and plague that wreak destruction on cities and people, agricultural land, and livestock. Many of these same biblical verses locate this devastation in Egypt, a bounteous land to which Israelites have fled or emigrated in search of security and wealth. Strikingly, even among the wealthy, cultured Jews of Toledo, plague rebukes survivors for their laxity in a comfortable exile. The echoes of biblical punishment surround them: abandoned land and livestock, shortages and famine, economic and environmental catastrophe. Equally important, beyond the dating, conventions, and the specific allusions to plague, none of the other conventions here are new. Echoes of Joseph's inscription ring among several earlier epitaphs in the collection, especially examples where a parent grieved the loss of a child. Their language returns a century later in Joseph Bar Meir's epitaph. The plague memorialist was comfortable recycling their idiom. Minimally, this suggests that the catastrophe represented by the Black Death, in Castile at least, was not perceived in the cataclysmic terms that it found elsewhere. Or perhaps the death of a child is its own cataclysm, and the scale of surrounding catastrophe has nothing to do with it. After 1348, plague rarely inspired anti-Jewish violence, preferring other targets: foreigners, physicians, increasingly the poor, But plague itself was a frequent visitor, and people learned to live with it individually and collectively. For individuals and families, the specter of plague tagged love and intimacy, security, and future dreams. On a collective level, governments and health professionals planned as well as reacted, devising policies and institutions still with us today. It is plague that gave us boards of health with their statisticians, inspectors, notaries, and regulators, quarantines, and new border control mechanisms, passports that doubled as certificates of health, and the pest houses known as lazarettos that housed the sick, their contacts, and the convalescent. Plague dictated prayer processions on the one hand and restrictions on public worship on the other. Priests gave remote communion and confession, rabbis preached from their windows, and Jews made final confession from their doorways with a minyan stationed safely across the street. The sick and their families who were not forcibly removed to lazarettos might be confined, literally boarded into their homes, with dedicated porters bringing them supplies. The chronically poor and the newly destitute were entitled to public charities supplied by Christians to Christians and by Jews to Jews. Italy was in the forefront of all of these developments and recurring outbreaks of plague, and also newer epidemics like typhus and smallpox, which is another story. In Italy, too, we see the rise of the Jewish ghettos. And one of the things I've been studying recently is the response to plague in the ghetto, where a highly developed infrastructure emerged to oversee health policy and to interface with the Christian city and the health office. And I can talk about that later if you want. But my final example comes from the world of prayer. Jewish prayers for plague were not exclusively of one form. Sometimes Jews wrote new compositions, but more often beloved hymns or piyutim, right? Or even psalms like Psalm 91, right? Worked just fine. And 16th and 17th century prayer books continued to recycle them. Familiar prayers from the fixed liturgy were also read in newly relevant ways. And one amazing example is the Pitum HaKetoret, a fusion of biblical, Mishnaic, and Talmudic descriptions of the grinding of the sacred incense used in the ancient temple. The daily liturgy incorporates these readings into the morning and the afternoon service. They include Exodus 30, verses 7-8 and 34 to 36, which describe God commanding Moses to prepare the incense, and another passage synthesized from the Babylonian Talmud, Keritot 6a, and the Yerushalmi, Yoma 4:5, describing the incense and how it is its composition, its preparation, and how it should be stored. Another link between incense and plague survived in the Bible in Numbers 17, where Moses again commands Aaron to offer incense to halt a plague that is raging among the Israelites. And medieval rabbis alluded directly to the prophylactic power of the incense and its potency against plague. Early modern readers in Italy went even farther. Some, like Abraham Portaleone, who died in 1612, praised Moses' pharmacological expertise. And for men like Portaleone, biblical and rabbinic sources represented a font of lost knowledge whose rediscovery would add luster to the Jewish nation. And Portaleone's magnum opus on the biblical cult, Shiltei HaGibur, dedicated 11 chapters to incense. His treatment demonstrated his knowledge of Jewish sources, but also his knowledge of Dioscorides and the classical botanical corpus, enriched by consultations with the spice grinders and pharmacists in Mantua. And here you see the spice grinders in Venice, not Mantua, but and they're all out there pounding away on the year's batch of theriac, a wonder drug used especially to treat plague. For other early modern Jews, biblical incense had a metaphysical significance. Judah Moscato, who died in 1593, interpreted the incense passages symbolically as allusions to spiritual perfection. The Zohar explicitly described the incense, the biblical incense, as a plague prophylactic, invoking Neoplatonist notions found also in the anonymous mystical work known as the Sefer HaMeshiv. For Neoplatonist readers, biblical incense attracted and redirected the sympathy of a celestial body or force, and the incense liturgy in words could replicate that shift of energy. This mattered because plague is still associated with some kind of corruption of the air. So you want to control celestial forces and redirect them to purify the air. Most of these liturgies have an identical template. The Pitum HaKetoret passages from the Bible and Talmud, plus strings of verses from biblical plague narratives or other narratives of deliverance. And these verses are punctuated by prose supplications that describe themselves as substitutes for the incense used by Aaron to stop the plague. And toward the end, sometimes they insert an unpronounceable angel name, which I will show you later. But the text itself usually contains some variation, some version of this paragraph, right? And V'amod mikisei din, v'sheva al kisei rachamim, v'chamol aleinu v'al tapenu v'ol aleinu v'yonkenu, right? Right, stand down from the throne of judgment, sit on the throne of mercy, have forgiveness upon us and our babies and toddlers and nursing infants. Rebuke the adversary so he does not prosecute us. Do not let the destroying angel enter our homes. Rebuke, stop the plague among us. May it be your will, O Lord our God and the God of our fathers, to end among us and all your people, the house of Israel, pestilence, sword, famine, grief, sighing, evil, the destroying angel, the plague, the evil inclination, evil disease, the evil adversary, evil annihilation, and all wicked evil diseases that come into the world. Guard our comings and goings, now and forever, etc. Since plague was still believed to result from corruption of the air, medical regimens ubiquitously prescribed fumigations as correctives. But these were prescribed for medical reasons, not religious ones. Nonetheless, like their rabbis, when we look at Jewish physicians in this period, we find they devoted outsized attention to incense as a plague prophylactic, explicitly identifying the aromatic fumigations of the medical regimens with the incense of the biblical cult. The connection is polemical, as it locates the origins of a scientific remedy in Jewish sacred texts, the intellectual property of the Jews before it passed into Gentile hands, right? We had it first, right? The Jewish connection is illustrated in the Moshiach Chosim, a 1587 plague regimen by Abraham Yagel. And Yagel's section on incense is unusually extensive. He explains that the biblical incense was compounded to attract celestial effluvia to sympathetic earthly forms, redirecting planetary forces to purify the air of corruption. This knowledge was transmitted to Moses directly by the angel of death, who included the necessary recipes and some recitations. Later, rabbis arranged this knowledge for easier use, and they added psalms that were also effective against plague. Yagel concludes his regimen with several pill recipes, segulot, right, charms, and a commentary on Psalm 36. He then ends, what else, with the Pitum HaKetoret liturgy, and before his first string of verses, he includes the angel name I mentioned earlier. And here you see it, this is actually an original edition. You see this kind of set off, strange sequence of letters at the top, and kind of cleared it up for you a little, right? The first 6 letters of this angel name are an acrostic, right? And they come from Genesis 43:11. Suri, Dvash, Chet, right? Lot, Bodnim, Shkedim, the choice produce of the land that Jacob instructs Judah to take down to Egypt. Some balm, honey, gum, ladanum, pistachios, and almonds. The second 6 letters, the second, these sort of third and fourth words, right, are created by jumping forward 1 letter from the first 6 letters. So from a tzadi to a kuf, from a dalet to a hey, etc., right? And the last 6 letters are a repetition of the first 6. As Moshe Idel has shown, the use of this name as an anti-plague adjuration can be traced back to Joseph de la Reina and a Kabbalist named Isaac de Leon. And both of these men were wonder-working mystics active in Spain prior to the expulsion. So a century later, this tradition has taken root in northern Italy, still combating plague, but now also as cutting-edge medicine. In 1348, the physicians who confronted the Black Death knew they were helpless to cure it, and that is one reason it was so easy to conclude it was an act of God. 300 years later, when plague was familiar, physicians were also more cocky, but there was nothing in their remedies that could have conquered Yersinia pestis, a bacterial disease that responds well to antibiotics, but not so well to bleeding and fumigation. Containment measures isolate disease, as we know too well, but they do not kill it. However, healing is more than medicine. And then as now, prayer had a place on the menu of therapeutic options. Indeed, for many, prayer bestowed agency denied a medical consumer. Prayer, in the hope that God and the planets would hearken, gave voices to frightened, weary people who could not know when this plague, this time, would slacken and who would survive. So too, preparing scented fires and bed sheets like reliance on amulets and angels, engaged men and women, learned and less learned, in the work of repelling the angel of death. Today, it may startle to read Yegel's theory of sympathetic influence as an argument for starting the morning by sitting open-mouthed in the outhouse for 30 minutes to immunize yourself to putrefaction in the air. But that recommendation came to men and women tending afflicted family members amidst the unbearable stench of plague, or shut in their homes where the sounds and smells of sickness were no respecter of walls. Did the outhouse exercise build immunity? Hardly. Neither did music, pre-modern medicine, or unpronounceable names. But they offered, piecemeal or together, a way of being human that was very much under siege. That too is what we mean by healing. Not just technology and new medicines, from theriac to vaccines, but familiar rituals and meanings, human community and human prayer, human steadfastness and human compassion. Not just sweeping fixes unequally distributed, but a way to be afraid without being conquered by fear. Not just survival, but hope. Medicine aside, most medieval and early modern Jews, like Christians and Muslims, attributed plague to a God fed up with human sin. Ironically, this freed them to believe they could do something about it. Attack pollution, eat better diets, safeguard their cities and villages and farmland, provide the poor with decent housing and subsidies, guarantee care for the sick and dignity for the dead, and pray. In 2020, we are not so different. Perhaps after all, what we no longer hear God saying, we can hear when he speaks through a virus. And when we know what we no longer express in the language of sin, we can hear as an urgent challenge. Can you hear that song? Thank you.
Thank you so much for this. Thank you. I know that our Brighton congregation is the first one that has to head off. So I don't know if Rabbi Eli Tekwasera, if you want to open the question section, or anyone from your congregation. I think we're going to give you first dibs at asking a question. I'm going to set the screen in such a way again that you can unmute yourself. So please do, if you do have a question, just unmute yourself and ask. Oh, Ellie, I think you're still on mute, sorry.
Professor Einbinder, it's very fascinating to hear, and I'm just wondering about, you obviously making a reference to the coronavirus crisis, but the difference today is that we don't believe that this is a punishment from God, and I'm just wondering the extent to which that was something formulaic, or whether people really did believe, whether they were just adopting biblical reward and punishment theology, or they really did believe that when this plague afflicted them, they had they had committed sins, or whether that was just a trope for them.
Well, since we can't ask them, right, we don't know what they really believed. It's highly unlikely that, somebody would write down, this is a lot of nonsense, right? I mean, you wouldn't be likely to put that down and save it for posterity, right? But historians of medicine have looked carefully at the medical tracts written for a plague to ask that kind of question. How frequently is God invoked in a medical tract? And the answer is sometimes a lot, sometimes so, like, well, God is in charge of the heavens and the eclipse caused it, I mean, but so it's sort of, not that God was angry or anything, but that was, God is the ultimate mover. And sometimes God, especially in more practical and less theoretical tracks, God isn't so relevant, right? Because you just want to know how to make the pill and how to bleed people and how to fumigate your wounds. And the Jewish physicians seem to be more or less the same as their Christian and colleagues in that respect. So yes, I think, and obviously if you're looking at religious texts, what else are they going to say, right? So as you use the word trope, right? I mean, that is in fact the way they would express this kind of calamity, right? And what they meant behind it, we really can't answer, right? It is important to, I think it's under recognized often that different genres will use different explanations, right? However, that said, by the 16th or 17th centuries, clearly people have the option of thinking that God has nothing to do with it, right? And I suppose some of them did, right? I mean, the question is, again, where are they going to write that down? So without a sort of secret journal, then we don't have that information. I suspect that some of the liturgical work, right, is to provide that explanation for people who are in danger of slipping out, right? I mean, people who are saying, look, my kid didn't do anything that bad.
Right.
I think Petrarch says that, right? Or that, look, if this is God, like, nobody did anything that terrible, like, so you do find these expressions, not in religious setting, right? But I suspect that the religious literature itself is trying to create a kind of corral, right? To big enough to keep doubters inside, right? Because people are traumatized, right, and distraught. As for now, I was thinking about this the other day, and what I was thinking is what you just said, is that, like, we don't say, we're sinners and that's why, we have, coronavirus now, except that we do sort of, right? We say, oh, we haven't taken care of the environment, we haven't, we've developed, we've destroyed animal ecosystems and we've destroyed the balance of the ecosystem. So we are bringing animals, commensal, right? Animals that live like with us in contact with animals that live out there. And, what's the coronavirus if it's on a bat or wherever it comes from, right? It was happy being where it was, right? It didn't ask to be, brought to people, but, we work, so that we do, when you sort of think about it, we say, it's our fault, right? We did this, we ruined the planet, and therefore, these things are happening. And that is a kind of secular version of saying, mipnei avanotenu, right? And what's intriguing about it is that in both cases, right, whether we say we did it because we sinned, or whether we say we did it because look what we did to the planet, they're both very anthrocentric, whatever you call it, right? Human-centric ways of looking at events, right? And maybe it's time to move away from that, right? I mean, because it's like a little kid who thinks that, if your parents are mad, it's something you did, right? Or if something bad happens, it's something you did, right? And the sense of having the power to actually make that happen is very egotistical in a way. And I think that one thing I've been thinking about a lot is that clearly the planet can fight back, right? And it's not just about us. But I do think that in some way we do continue that way of thinking, right? We just put it in secular terms.
Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you. I think Barry has unmuted himself, so might have a question for us.
Sorry. Well, I mean, thank you for your. I mean, one thing I'm just thinking about is the connection between what was going on in the Middle Ages and what's going on today. And we hear some leaders describing the coronavirus as a Chinese virus. Was there any evidence that leaders in the Middle Ages located the virus as the responsibility of any people, Jews or other people?
Yeah, in 1348, so the Black Death, I mean, clearly Jews are blamed in large parts of Europe. And usually the theory is there that they did something like biowarfare, right? Like they did something to, you have to corrupt the air, right? So how do you corrupt the air? You have your, powder or your potion, and you throw it at the wall and into the wind or whatever, or in the well, right? And so Jews were blamed in a lot of, in significant parts of Europe in 1348, but not afterward. And yes, foreigners or particular nationalities will be blamed afterward, but it will change with the outbreak, right? So they become very, the more that a contagion theory starts to kind of compete with the air corruption theory, right? The more they become very interested in this, what we would call contact tracing, or this sort of patient zero problem, right? Of like, where did it start? And it was, you know, Shlomo who had the used mattress that he brought in from so-and-so, right? Or it was those Italians who, you know, their ship landed in our port and they were sick. So it's the Italians who did it, right? Or the Aragonese, or it's the merchants, or it's those
Not
foreign
just-
doctors.
It's not just a disease of humankind, and we're all facing it.
Yeah, so I mean, you know, there are people like Sam Cohn who teaches in Glasgow, I think, who, you know, people have, I mean, he's been trying to write about like what makes certain epidemics generate hysteria and scapegoating and others not, right? Like we know with Ebola, for instance, physicians are often attacked, right? That's also true later in the plague. It's also true by the 16th and 17th century in Italy that you have these accusations of what are called untori, right? These people who have these powders and unguents and they smear them around or throw them around. And it can be a homeless person. It can be the poor are increasingly targeted. So not an ethnic group, but a class group. And it's partly a result of people observing that poor people live in smellier, right, higher density environments,
More likely
less
to be afflicted.
hygienic, and so they see the poor as a kind of a vulnerable portal for moving plague into the rest of a population, and a lot of policies will then target the poor.
Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else who has a question for Professor Einbinder? If you just unmute yourself, then I should be able to see who wants to speak. It's a bit difficult. We're still too many to do the hand lifting. Everyone is being shy.
And while you're searching, I'll say, you know, now one of the really exciting things that plague historians talk about all the time is genetics, right? Because they now have mapped the whole plague genome, and we know that in fact it starts up in Central Asia, right, up around Kazakhstan, and first in China. It's actually in China around the 1230s, and it has to move all the way across, right? But and so as far as like the Chinese virus, right, there always was this sort of awareness that China and the Crimea were places that the plague came to Europe from in 1348. But what we now know from having the genetic tree is that after that, it goes back the other way. So the third pandemic in Hong Kong and in India, right, in the 1890s is a colonial export, right? It's brought from Britain and Europe back east.
Thank you. I think Cecil has a question.
I'd like to thank Rabbi Einbinder for a fascinating talk. I have a particular interest in the Jews in Castile, and I've been doing some research on their lives in 14th century Castile. I'm particularly fascinated by the epitaphs from Toledo. And I wonder whether two questions really. One is there any indication that these wonderful epitaphs were written by a single scribe? Does the manner and the style of the epitaph suggest one individual wrote them? And the other thing was, do we know where the victims were actually buried? And there has ever been any interest in exhuming the bodies of those who died?
The style question first. the epitaphs are in different styles, and we don't know who authored them in most cases, because, and that would be lovely to know, like the one that I read to you is such an elegant piece of Hebrew. It's clearly, somebody who knew poetry and knew Bible and knew style, right? It's a very beautiful piece of work, and a number of the others are also, but we don't know who wrote them, right? The epitaphs for the Ashkenazi family in the group are quite different in style, and they're not so elegant, right? They're much more prosaic and rabbinic in Hebrew, right? And full of different kinds of much sterner kind of religious piety, right? And so there is good evidence in the case of Judah ben Harosh that he wrote his own epitaph before he died, and that he may have written some of those for his family members. And so in that case, and you have his last will and testament, so you can actually sort of compare some of the same formulations, right? And but no, I mean, it would be great to know, and I don't think we really even know, and this is, I've asked several people this, who did the carving? I mean, was it a Jew or was it a Christian? Right? In Italy, we know that actually they were Christian masons, and they were given templates by a Jewish writer, and who sort of supervised to make sure that the writing was correct. But in later in Italy, for instance, the Masons were a guild that did not allow Jews in, and so the stone carving itself was done by Christians. In Toledo, I don't know, and I have not found anybody who can give me information on that. As to where they were buried and whether you could find them now, they're under that housing development somewhere, and and the bodies that were removed. This is a sad story, so I don't want to sound as annoyed by it as I feel, but the bodies that were removed because of the intervention of outside groups who felt that it was a violation of the remains to allow the archaeologists to work on them, the bodies were very summarily removed from the archaeologists' possession and buried in the modern cemetery, the Jewish cemetery in Barcelona. So they're completely out of where they belong, and whatever wasn't discovered and what was discovered was all covered over by this housing development. So until there's like a major earthquake or something, we'll never see them again.
Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know if anyone else, nobody else has unmuted themselves. If anyone else wants to ask another question. Can I give people a short moment? No, nobody's coming forward. In that case, I think it's our pleasure to be able to say thank you to you. Thank you so much for joining us for this fascinating talk. I think every year, I think for Tishah B'av, what can we do? And we have, Rabbi Naomi and I have discussions about it. And this topic just really seemed to jump out at us in light of our current experience. And in this case, it worked in our favor. So thank you so much for agreeing to do this for us from a distance. And we can't even present you with any kind of gift. But just so that everyone else knows, Rabbi Professor Einbinder has asked, instead of an honorarium, that we are making a donation to a human rights charity To thank you for this talk, we will be making a donation to Renee Kassan, which probably most of the people who are on this call will have heard of. It's a UK Jewish human rights charity. They do a lot of very good work. So thank you so much for joining us. It's really been such a pleasure. Maybe this is just the first of many things that we can do across the pond. So much of your work is so fascinating that I'm sure we could do many more things on this issue. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you all for the invitation. And I have to say it's a challenge to speak to yourself. I had to line up a few little, audience members here, but I really, I hope someday to, be back on a plane and come and see you, and I would love to do that. And thank you for launching your evening of commemoration with this invitation, and thank you to Rabbi Leah, and I will let you go on to your evening.
I just want to say on behalf of Kol Chai as well, thank you so much.
Oh, one second, Naomi, let me just find you so I can spotlight you. Sorry. So it's easier for everyone to actually see you. There you go.
I just wanted to say on behalf of Kol Chai, the other community here, thank you so much, Susan. It was a fascinating talk. I know that a lot of our members really love listening about Jewish history and understanding Jewish history, and it's a silver lining, really, to the crisis that we're in, that geography is no barrier, that you can be over there and come and speak to us over here, and that's really wonderful. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you for thinking of it and giving it a try.
Thank you so much. To everyone else, if you do want to stay for our service, I think we're just going to take probably 2 or 3 minutes to get ourselves ready for that, but you can stay on the same Zoom call. If you want to, in the meantime, unmute yourself and chat a short moment with each other, that's absolutely fine. And I think we'll, at 1:15, probably we'll restart with the service. Again, thank you so much, Susan, for joining us. Thank you, everyone, for attending. I feel a bit bad for the poor Brighton congregation who missed the last question, but they all posted how wonderful the talk was. So they were also very grateful. Thank you so much. And we'll join again in 3 minutes for the service.
Thank you.
While we're waiting for the service, for those of you who find it easier to read liturgy as a PDF and not have it as a screen share, then you should be able to click on this link and download the PDF for the service. We will share the service on slides. So the slides will look slightly different to the PDF, but hopefully that gives you a chance to see if you find it easier to follow along in the PDF. And then we just need to make sure that we have everyone who Robin, I think, has kindly agreed to sing for us. So I'm going to make Robin the co-host as well. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the spotlight off, and so we can see each other. If you don't want to be seen online because we're still streaming live, if you just turn your camera off, then you will not be seen online. But otherwise, we can actually see each other again. Wonderful.
It's nice to be able to see into people's homes, I think.
Yeah, it's sort of an interesting balance always, isn't it? I think everyone should be able to unmute themselves if you want to say hello to each other. That's totally fine. I just want to give people, if they need a moment, to just take a breath, a chance to take a breath.
Want to welcome Christina and Anthony, who I think was just joined us. Hi.
It's the lovely thing that now pets can join in with all synagogue events. Rabbi Einbinder was saying that she had to feed the cat right before the session because she was worried that the cat would otherwise join.
Yeah. Nice to physically see you, Robin. I know you've been there at 7 o'clock, but just turned your camera on, so hello.
Yeah. But Jewish services have always been tolerant of children, so taking them on to pets is only one step further. It's progressive.
Not just intergenerational, but interspecies. Yeah, the next progression, definitely. There's some synagogue that's done pet service, or maybe it's in America. Somewhere has done.
No, yeah, so Southgate Progressive Yuval Keren has done one, and we're doing one I think in August.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
But we have decided not to be so brave. We've decided that anything to do with animals and children should be pre-recorded on camera. So we're actually pre-recording.
Yuval and his family are members of Kol Chai.
Well, I don't know if they were for a long time. I don't know if they are. Mr. Rabbi of Southgate Progressive now, so
yeah, but they live very close. They are very close to.
They live in Haggen Pinner. Yeah,
they live between us. Actually, they live between Pinner and Northwood.
Yeah, exactly. Like Northwood Hills. Yeah. Lovely. Everyone is coming, I think, and joining us again.
Barbara, are you back home?
You're on mute, Barbara.
Unmute. Thank you. Yeah, I'm coming back on Sunday.
Oh, you're still there.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah. Stephen and Lucy and Oscar are coming up tomorrow, and we're going to go across to Edinburgh where they're staying. We're going to stay with them for a couple of days, and then then I'm going to come back with them in the car. So
lovely.
It's quite a, looking, it's been away for a long time. So,
you have been. You really have been. It's been a long time.
Yeah, so that will be nice. And I've got some time off next week to open the post and tidy the flat up and do whatever's needed. So and spend time with my new grandson as well. And
lovely. Enjoy that. Yeah, lots of cuddles. Give them our love.
Yeah. How are you? Are you all right? You well? Yeah. The baby's all right. Well, she's not a little baby anymore. She's a little girl.
No, yeah, she's quite a little girl. Yeah, bit of a rash and a bit poorly, but she's generally fine.
And she reinvented the terrible twos.
Yeah, they're all doing.
I'm biting my tongue a lot by saying, you think this is bad. You don't know what it was like when our mother was like this.
Very nice. I think we're going to start with our service so that we don't keep you too late, although it's still, at least in Haggen, it's still bright and light. Not even quite Tishah B'av yet.
That's my window, yeah.
Indeed.
We're welcoming it in. We're welcoming it in. Do you welcome in Tishah B'av? We're anticipating it.
Absolutely. This is the other beautiful thing about the being able to virtually travel around the world, that you can basically celebrate Erev Tishah B'av probably for the next 10 hours. You just need to hop from place to place. We're going to again, sorry about that, but put you on mute while doing the service so that you can join in as much as you like, but we don't have the Zoom problem of everyone trying to compete for the one slot of sound coming through. So we're going to put you on mute. It's really our pleasure. Rabbi Naomi and I will be leading the service together. So do join in if you find it easier than with the PDF, or otherwise, if I'm not going to have screen sharing failure again, then hopefully I'll be able to share with you my screen, which should get us the liturgy in a moment. There we are. Some of you will already be familiar with some of this because you will have seen some of it over the years at our joint services together. So we begin with a short reading about entering Tishah B'av. Tishah B'av recalls many tragedies of Jewish history: destruction of the temples in Jerusalem, the Crusades, repeated exiles, and the final solution of the Holocaust. In our own day, Tishah B'av beckons us into the darkness of inner exile, so we can emerge into the season of Teshuvah, the season of return. Enfolded in community, we invoke the depth of Tishah B'av for the sake of rising anew. Invocation by Rachel Barenblatt. As Tishah B'av approaches, we begin our descent toward the rubble. Our hearts crack open and sorrow comes flooding in. Help us to believe that tears can transform, that redemption is possible. The walls will come down, open our eyes, give us strength not to look away. And Robin has agreed to sing for us, I believe.
Eli, Eli, שלא ייגמר לעולם, החול והים, רשרוש של המים, רק השמיים, תפילת האדם, החול והים, רשרוש של המים, רק השמיים, תפילת האדם. אלי, אלי, שלא ייגמר לעולם, החול והים, רשרוש של המים, רק השמיים, תפילת האדם, החול והים, רשרוש של המים, רק השמיים, תפילת האדם.
Thank you. We join together for the Shema. Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Leolam Vaed. ואהבת את אדוני אלוהיך בכל לבבך ובכל נפשך ובכל מאודיך. והיו הדברים האלה אשר אנוכי מצווך היום על לבביך. ושיננתם לבניך ודיברת בם, בשבתך בביתך ובלכתך בדרך ובשוכבך ובקומך, וקשרתם לעוד על ידיך, והיו לטוטפות בין עיניך, וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ובשעריך. למען תזכרו, עשיתם את כל מצוותיי, והייתם קדושים לאלוהיכם. אני, אדוני אלוהיכם, אשר הוצאתי אתכם מארץ מצרים, להיות לכם אלוהים. אני אדוני אלוהיכם.
From the deepest place within me, I call out to you. God, hear what is in my voice. Hear my pleading tone. For you to look for imperfection, who could stand it? Who could stand it? You are so generous with pardon, but we fear to seek it. Still, I hope, God. My very soul hopes for it. Please, send me your loving word. Among the watchers for the dawn, my God, I yearn for your grace to end my darkness. Israel looks to you, God, who are so gracious. So easily you can free all of us. Lift us from all our brokenness. And we remember the community in exile. We remember the original exile when the temple was destroyed. And we remember all the time, all the many, many times the Jewish people have been in exile since. And we remember on this day the ways in which we are still in exile, the ways in which we are in exile from ourselves, from our normal patterns of living this year, from our ability to meet in person together and sing together. Remember all the times that we are still at some level in exile. Wherever Israel was exiled, God's Shekhinah, God's indwelling presence, went with them. They were exiled to Egypt, and Shekhinah went with them, as in, didn't I reveal myself to your ancestors in Egypt? They were exiled to Babylon, and Shekhinah went with them, as in, for your sake, I was sent to Babylon. And when Israel is redeemed in the future, Shekhinah will go with them. V'hu rachum yichaper avon v'lo yashchit. The merciful one will cover iniquity and not forever destroy. V'heba lahashiv apo v'lo ya'ir kol chamato. Soon may God withdraw anger and not arouse such rage. When we come to the Amida, this central standing prayer, we're going to do a very short version, silent version tonight. My God, so near, and tonight seeming so far away, be with me during moments of darkness, pain, destruction, and exile. Help me find holy stillness, even amidst rubble, serenity amidst loneliness, hope amidst despair. Open my mouth, and even now my lips will declare your praise. Adonai, Tzevatai Tiftach, Ufia Kitehilata. Adonai, Tzevatai Tiftach, Ufia Kitehilata. We're going to have a couple of minutes of silent meditation. I invite you to do one of two things. You can read this poem, Ancestors and Elders, Or you can spend a couple of minutes, if you prefer, contemplating what is broken in our world.
I'm sorry, guys, say what you've done. Fine.
Libi lefanecha Adonai zuri v'gali. Oseh shalom b'mamav u'yaseh shalom aleinu ve'al kol Yisrael ve'al kol bnei Adam. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu, Yakol Yisrael. Yaseh shalom, Yaseh shalom, shalom aleinu, Yakol Yisrael. Emru, Amen.
The Temple by Alden Solovey. Do not mourn for the Temple Mount. The stones mourn for you. They mourn for you who have forgotten that God's voice can still be heard in the hills. The stones mourn for you who have forgotten that God's voice can still be heard in the valleys, in the forests and deserts, in the waters and skies. Do not mourn for the lost priests. The tribes mourn for you. They mourn for you who have forgotten that God's people are one. Ephraim and Judah, the Levites and the daughters of Zelophehad, ask why we still divide the house of Israel, why we still cast judgment, why we spurn each other with anger. The tribes mourn for you who have forsaken your brothers and rejected your sisters, closing your minds and hardening your hearts. Do not mourn for the lost sacrifices, the yearling without blemish, the ephah of fine flour and the hin of oil. Mourn for you. They mourn for you who have forgotten that God requires your love and your power, your hope and your deeds. The yearling, the flour, and the oil mourn for you who have forgotten that God wants the blood that flows through you, the strength of your days, your song and your laughter, your wisdom and healing. Tear your clothes and sit in ashes if you must. Then rise up and listen to God's call. Love my people Israel. Love all of my people Israel. Then you will know the depth of my righteousness and will drink from the well of my compassion. Give them your heart, Give them your days in service with joy and thanksgiving, so that my glory will dwell among you, and that your days are long on this earth. God has pity on kindergarten children. God pities kindergarten children. He has less pity on school children, and on grown-ups, no pity at all. He leaves them alone, and sometimes they must crawl on all fours in the burning sun to reach the first aid station covered with blood. But perhaps he will watch over true lovers and have mercy on them and shelter them like a tree over the old man sleeping on a public bench. Perhaps we too will give them the last rare coins of charity that Mother handed down to us, so that their happiness may protect us now and on other days.
I tell you, hopeless grief is passionless. The only men incredulous of despair, half taught in anguish, through the midnight air beat upwards to God's throne in loud access of shrieking and reproach. Full desertness in souls as countries lieth silent bare under the blanching vertical eye glare of the absolute heavens. Deep-hearted man, express grief, for they dead in silence like to death, most like a monumental statue set in everlasting watch, and moveless woe till itself crumbles the dust beneath. Touch it. The marble eyelids are not wet. If it could weep, it could arise and go. And these are all modern kinot, modern laments, the tradition of Tishah B'av. And I think laments are a really important thing. Lament is a wail of a poem. It's a cry from the heart. And it's been such a traumatic period of time over the last few months. Professor Susan Einbinder talked about trauma. So I think maybe what we need now is a lament, is a wail against the world that has changed, against the people that have died, against the people who are isolated, against the devastation wreaked by this plague. And this is a lament about the pandemic, about our pandemic. The enemy could be anywhere. The tiny spiky mace that liquefies the lungs and clots the vessels in the brain could be on a door handle or a package or a light switch or lingering in the air. Going to the grocery store or the mechanic is a walk through the valley of the shadow. This flimsy scrap of fabric over my nose and mouth is my shield. Hand sanitizer, my chainmail. Will soap and water protect me? I want to feel your presence, your cool embrace on my hot skin, your glorious light like early dawn breaking. I don't want to walk through the world afraid.
So we turn to a few short sections from Eicha, from Lamentations, the Megillah for Tishah B'av, for this day. Eicha, alas, lonely sits the city once great with people. She that was great among nations has become like a widow. The princess among states has become a thrall. Bitterly she weeps in the night, her cheek wet with tears. There's none to comfort her of all her friends. All her allies have betrayed her. They have become her foes. Judah has gone into exile because of misery and harsh oppression. When she settled among the nations, she found no rest. All her pursuers overtook her in the narrow places. Zion's roads are in mourning, empty of festival pilgrims. All her gates are deserted. Her priests sigh, her maidens are unhappy. She's utterly disconsolate. Her enemies are now the masters, her foes are at ease, because the Eternal One has afflicted her for her many transgressions. Her infants have gone into captivity before the enemy. Gone from fair Zion are all that were her glory. Her leaders were like stags that found no pasture. They could only walk feebly before the pursuer. All the precious things she had in the days of old, Jerusalem recalled in her days of woe and sorrow, when her people fell by enemy hands with none to help her, when enemies looked on and gloated over her downfall. Jerusalem has greatly sinned, therefore she has become a mockery. All who admired her despise her, for they have seen her disgraced, and she can only sigh and shrink back.
Gone is the joy of our hearts. Our dancing is turned into mourning. The crown has fallen from our head. Woe to us that we have sinned. Because of this, our hearts are sick. Because of these, our eyes are dimmed. Because of Mount Zion, which lies desolate, jackals prowl over it. But you, O Eternal One, are enthroned forever. Your throne endures through the ages. Why have you forgotten us utterly, forsaken us for all time? Take us back, O Eternal One, to yourself, and let us come back. Renew our days as of old. For truly, you have rejected us, bitterly raged against us. Take us back, O Eternal One, to yourself, and let us come back. Renew our days as of old. Ashirenu, Ashirenu, Adonai Elecha, B'na Shuva, B'na Shuva, Kadesh, Kadesh, Yameinu Kakadam, Kadesh, Kadesh, Yameinu Kakadam.
Eicha, A Lament for the Earth by Tamara Cohen. Eicha, alas, she sits in danger. Earth, her home to multitudes, like a beloved deep in distress. Blue ocean, source of life, endangered and imprisoned. Bitterly she weeps in the night, her shorelines wet with tears. Of all her friends, none to comfort her. All her allies have betrayed her. Checker spot butterflies flee their homes. Polar bears can find no rest, because our greed has heated earth. Whole communities destroyed to pursue offshore oil. Lives and dreams have been narrowed. Coastlines mourn for families, lost homes and livelihoods. Barrier islands lament, desolate. Wetlands sigh without their songbirds. Estuaries grieve, the sea is embittered. Earth's children, now her enemies. Despite destruction, we sleep at ease. The breath of life grieves our abundant transgressions, infants of every species captive to our conceit. Hashivenu ya elecha, v'nashuva, chadesh yameinu kekedem. Let us return, help us repent. You who breathe all life, Breathe us into a new path. Help us, help us, help us turn to a new way of living. Make new, make new.
And we move to Kaddish. I just want to give a moment just in case anyone is saying Kaddish for anybody today or this week. If you are, just say that, unmute yourself and say their name now. So I want to say Kaddish for all those Jews who have been murdered through the centuries for who they are, for what they believe in, right up until the modern day, from the destruction of the temple onwards. And I also want to remember all those who have died of plague, both back in the Middle Ages and in this terrible plague of our day, Jewish and non-Jewish. Yikadar v'yikadar shemei Rabbah, v'alma divrach chirutei v'yamlich malchutei, v'chayachon v'yomechon, v'chayei dechol Beit Yisrael, v'magala v'zman kariv v'imru, Amen. Yehei shmei Rabbah mevarach le'olam olamei amaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ah v'yitramam v'yitnaseh. V'yithada v'yithalei v'yithalal shemei dekudsham brichu. Leila min kol b'rachata v'shurata. Shishbechata v'nechemata. Damiram b'amav v'imru. Amen. Yehei shlama Rabbah min shemaya. V'chayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael. V'imru. Amen. Osei shalom b'mromav. V'yasei shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael. V'al kol b'nei Adam. V'imru. Amen. Return again, return again, return to the land of your soul. Return again, return again, return to the land of your soul. Return to who you are, return to what you are, return to where you are, born and reborn again. Return again, return again, return to the land of your soul. This people is likened to the dust and likened to the stars, and they go down to the dust, and they rise up to the stars. Esanai el heharim me'ayin yavo Ezri me'im Adonai Osei shamayim ba'aretz.
I think it was the last slide.
Oh, yeah, I've lost, hang on.
Oh, have you lost us?
I'm back again. I don't know what happened there. So I just wanted to end by reminding us that on Tishah B'av, the darkest day in the Jewish year, in the afternoon of Tishah B'av, so tomorrow afternoon, it is said that the Messiah will be born. And what that's a metaphor for is, of course, that at the darkest time comes a glimmer of hope. And as we really, this year more than any other year, I think, experience brokenness and loss, know that it is at this point that things can start to get better. And Tishah B'av will lead straight away. The moment Tishah B'av is over, we go into the 7 weeks of consolation that take us all the way up through the summer to Rosh Hashanah, and a time of healing and a time of repair. So I obviously want to thank Rabbi Leah for putting this service together and for hosting us this evening. I want to thank everyone for joining us. I wish you well for the rest of Tishah B'av, whether you're fasting or not. And I wish you all well for the journey of healing over the next 7 weeks until we get to Rosh Hashanah.
Amen. I don't think I have anything else to add except to say thank you. Thank you, Rabbi Naomi, and thank you to everyone at Kol Chai. Thank you also for helping with the singing and for Robin joining us with singing so beautifully. And everyone really, it's always a highlight for me. I know it's a bit strange that Tishah B'av is a highlight, but it's always lovely that for so many years, our communities have come together and created a meaningful moment at this time. So have a wonderful rest of the evening. May this be a start of a journey of consolation. And I wish you all well. Erev Tov.
Erev Tov.